Hello and welcome to Bud's RPG Review, where I give my thoughts on role-playing games, card games and board games. Welcome to part 3 of my review of Masks of Nyarlathotep for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition by Chaosium. In this video I will be covering 2 chapters, Campaign Beginning and America. I have added in the Campaign Beginning chapter as it is quite small at 7 pages long. Okay, first up let's look at that. This small chapter serves as a launch pad for the 2 ways to start the campaign proper, having done the Peru chapter with Jackson Elias, or with the players simply being good friends. Since the events of Peru, should the players have taken this route, 4 years have passed and Elias has corresponded regularly with them as he has travelled the globe in search of strange cults. In early January 1925, they will receive a radiogram from him from a ship at sea where he mentions the Carlisle expedition. If they didn't play the Peru chapter, he is just a good friend. We're given 2 sheets of information based on whether Peru was done or not, which gives the players a breakdown of their relationships with him. Should the players want to dig further into the Carlisle expedition, they can discover that it was published widely and there are a number of press cuttings that the players can easily obtain, which are shown over the next few pages. These serve as a primer for the players as to what happened and where things currently stand with the ill-fated expedition. After this, we have Chapter 2, America. The chapter starts by discussing the beginning steps you should take, that being whether you have started with Peru or jumped in here as per the traditional campaign. Events begin in America, specifically New York City. The aims of this chapter are to find the clues left behind and put together the pieces that lead to either Kenya, Egypt, England, China or Australia. It discusses the connections that the Carlisle expedition had with New York and then moves on to Jackson Elias's timeline. He spent a great deal of time here visiting his publisher, Prospero House, and living in the Hotel Chelsea as he had no permanent address. He left for Africa on May 25, 1923 to research a new project which led him to Nairobi, where he stumbled upon the truth of the Carlisle massacre, and he continued to follow the trail through to Hong Kong, then Shanghai, then Cairo and London. Finally, he headed back to New York, arriving on January 13, 1925, sending a radiogram to one of the investigators asking for help looking into the Carlisle expedition. He is meant to meet them on January 15, 1925. It then moves on to some notes on running the chapter, where events should culminate at Juju House, and also gives us the full considerations for proceedings. After this, it goes on to arriving in New York. It gives us a map of the area and a fair amount of notes with regard to the setting of New York City, and also gives us a frankly confusing clue diagram for America, which is more akin to a map of the subway system than something that would be easy to follow. It talks about the geography of New York City, as well as the Manhattan skyline, and mentions the weather. At this time, the city is under a blanket of thick snow, with howling winds and sub-zero temperatures, and it moves through the various modes of transport that were available, including prices in some cases. It then talks about the accommodation that is available to those investigators who are not from around these parts, and then goes into the research that the players can conduct and where, should they arrive in New York City early and want to get the jump on anything Jackson is wanting to discuss with them with regard to the Carlisle expedition. It then moves on to the cult in residence in New York City, the Cult of the Bloody Tongue. This particular branch was formed in 1917 by a group of Kenyan immigrants to support Mwero and has grown steadily, including people of varied ethnic backgrounds. Many of these people are vulnerable, seeking easy answers and help, which the cult leader, Mukunga Mundari, can readily provide, whereas some of the cultists just want to engage in bloodlust, and others driven to madness by the horrors that they have witnessed. The cult stems from the particular aspect of Nyarlathotep that has a single blood-red tentacle as a face, and the cult symbol may look to the uninitiated like a set of brackets surrounding a flower, though those with skills in biology or zoology may think it looks more like the mouth of a lamprey. Cultists often have it tattooed on their bodies, and indeed those who happen to see Augustus Larkin's tattoo in Peru can make the connection. The cult is headquartered in Harlem in a shop that sells African tribal paraphernalia, Juju House, and rites are performed in the large basement. Silas Nkwane runs the shop. Assassins of the cult usually wield the panga, a long East African bush knife that resembles a machete with a curved tip, and cult executioners wear a hideous headpiece that has a dangling red stripe protruding from the forehead, with more senior cult members having an actual human tongue hanging from theirs. It gives us the pulp stats for African 3-pronged throwing knives, and then moves on to the dramatis personae for this chapter. As per the others in this book, it gives a decent description of each of them alongside their traits, some role-playing hooks, and also at which point in the chapter they come in, as well as giving a small portrait of each of them. As we haven't met the vast majority of them yet, I will quickly go through them. There's Lieutenant Martin Poole, a homicide detective who could be a replacement for any of the investigators that die in this chapter. Jonah Kensington, the owner and editor-in-chief of Prospero House. Carlton Ramsey, the lawyer and executor of Jackson Elias's estate. Erica Carlisle, the sister of Roger Carlisle, and her bodyguard Joe Corey, Bradley Gray, Erica Carlisle's counsellor and confidant, Miriam Atwright, a reference librarian at Harvard University, Professor Anthony Dimmesdale Cowles, a professor of anthropology, and his daughter Eva Seawood Cowles, Arthur Emerson, an unwitting cult associate and importer, Dr. Mordecai Lemming, an eccentric and wealthy folklorist, Rebecca Schosenberg, a New York Times reporter and seeker into a miscarriage of justice, Hilton Adams, an innocent man, and Millie Adams, his desperate and determined wife, and also his friends Needham Johnson, a reporter to the New York Age, Douglas Fells, a sculptor, Art Mills, a jazz musician, and Jackie Wallace, a hospital orderly. After this it moves on to the adversaries of the chapter. Captain Walter Robson, a corrupt cop in the payoff of the Bloody Tongue, Mukunga Mdari, the high priest of the Bloody Tongue, and Silas Nkwane, manager of Juju House. It also lists a number of minor NPCs, such as Willa Sly, Carlton Ramsey's legal secretary, and George Brunton, a sub-warden of Sing Sing. Okay, so now we have the background cast of characters described and move on to the scenario itself. It starts with Jackson Elias calling his friends on January the 15th, asking them to meet him at the Hotel Chelsea, room 410 at 8 p.m. He comes across as cryptic, anxious, and perhaps scared. He would give no further information if pressed, and will hang up. Odd behaviour to those who knew him, and it should leave the investigators eager to want to know more. When the players arrive at room 410, there are a number of options, as knocking will not be answered. Listening at the door allows them to hear Jackson let out one final scream as he dies. The scenario presents options with regard to what to do at the room. If they go straight in, they find Jackson dead, his intestines ripped out, and the cult symbol carved on his head. They find the three killers still there, armed with pangas with their ceremonial headdress on. The killers are leaving via the fire escape. If they delay entering, then they can see the killers get away down the alley below. It gives rules for chasing the cultists, although the inclement weather has a serious effect on their success. The killers are assumed to have grabbed some of the clues that Jackson was assembling, with each cultist having specific ones. If they don't enter, they hear about Jackson's murder in the newspapers the following day, where they will also discover that a man, Hilton Adams, had previously been arrested and charged for similar murders and is now on death row in Sing Sing prison. Should the investigators capture any of the killers, there's nothing to be gained due to their insanity from participation in cult rituals, and they will be savagely beaten by the police and never seen again. Room 410 contains a plethora of clues detailed here that links all of the chapters in the campaign, and it is Jackson Elias's information that he had gathered. These are all printed on the following pages. What the players need to decide is their next step. We have a section called Preliminary Investigations. Here, it offers advice on how to keep the investigators on the trail, emphasising the loss of their good friend. They have several avenues of exploration open to them based on the clues that they may find in room 410, ones that lead to Emerson Imports, Mordecai Lemming, Hilton Adams and Miriam Atwright. Should the cultists escape with the clues, they have other routes open to them. The next section is partially presented in the order they happen in, beginning with the NYPD. Unless they fled New York City, the police arrive and will interview them about Elias's murder. This will introduce them to Lieutenant Martin Poole, who will take statements from them. Unless they did something unwise with regard to Jackson's body, he will not consider them suspects, though if they killed any of the cultists, he will ask them to accompany him to Precinct 7A, where they will be questioned. He is a hard-nosed police veteran who can, with the right combination of contact, persuasion and fast talking, inform them that this is the 9th murder of this kind in the last 2 years. The murders appear to be unconnected, non-class or race-based and from all over the city. They can discover that Dr. Mordecai Lemming, an eccentric Manhattanite and folklorist, has linked the symbol carved into the victims' heads to an African death cult, and that all investigations were closed when Captain Robson in Harlem arrested Hilton Adams for the murders. Poole is now rightly concerned that the wrong man is in prison. If the investigators manage to capture any of the cultists, Lieutenant Poole will be angry that Robson has taken them. He can also inform the investigators that an old black Hudson was seen leaving the murder scene after 8 p.m. and that it was stolen from Harlem. The next thing, chronologically, is Jackson's funeral. This happens at Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn and has a small turnout that has the investigators, Jonah Kensington, Carlton Ramsey and his niece Willa Sly. Reporters are there but keep a respectful distance. After the funeral, the investigators are approached by one of them, Rebecca Schosenberg, who is keen to talk to them about the connection between Jackson's murder and those for which Hilton Adams was imprisoned. If they show interest, she arranges to meet them at the New York Times offices. Jonah and Carlton both introduce themselves to the investigators, where Kensington will invite them to visit him at Prospero House, and Ramsey will ask them to attend the reading of Elias's will at his office the following Monday. It then moves on to the reading of the will at Carlton Ramsey's office. He offers the investigators a drink and his condolences for the death of Elias, stating that he is happy to have his friends around. He explains that Elias visited him the day before his death and updated his will, with Ramsay believing that he feared for his life. The will has several items of importance to the investigators. His wealth is to create a fund for his friends to investigate the Carlisle expedition. He'll pay for travel, accommodation, etc., with Ramsay being the central point of contact for this. He also leaves a "from beyond the grave" note where he explains his wishes. Ramsay is also an ideal person to introduce other good friends of Jackson Elias to replace investigators that meet their end in the campaign, as Ramsay has Elias's little black book. It then shifts to Prospero House and another friend of Jackson's, Jonah Kensington, who was also the editor of all of Jackson's books. Talking to Jonah will reveal that he shares Jackson's theory of a blood cult and that some old enemies finally caught up with him. He has all of Jackson's correspondences on file, where it clearly states that members of the expedition may still be alive, and mentions that some contradictory testimony in the trial had been discovered. The notes will show Jackson's globetrotting through Kenya, Hong Kong and London, with him sounding ever so slightly crazier as he mentions that he had seen unbelievable things and discovered a conspiracy of worldwide proportions. He mentioned that there is a timetable and that he needed to visit Australia. His final notes from New York City are a bewildering fragmented collection, and Jonah will hold back showing these to the investigators unless a difficult charm, fast talk or persuade is passed. The pages are folded and stitched together with single words being repeated for several pages and written with clear agitation. The next section deals with meeting Erica Carlisle, Roger's sister. She is a socialite and heir to the Carlisle business fortune. She lives in Westchester and can be read about in the society column of any local newspaper. All inquiries are directed towards Bradley Gray from the law firm Dunstan, Whittleby and Gray, who is her confidant and legal representative that the investigators must impress in order to have any traction in meeting her. Should he be approached, he will want to know why they want to speak to her, and the mention of her brother possibly being alive will pique his interest. If they bypass Gray, she will always be too busy or uninterested in speaking to them and will point blank refuse to answer questions in public. Additionally, she has no desire to discuss Roger, as she detested him while alive, as he nearly ruined the Carlisle interests, draining them of money and mistreating Erica, giving her no say in financial matters. Since she gained control of the business, it has flourished. It gives various ways in which the investigators can attempt to gain an audience with her, including crashing parties she is attending, and even gaining employment in her household. It gives information on the Carlisle estate, which is very secure, and moves on to the interview itself, assuming the investigators manage to get one. Upon meeting her, she will admit that she knew Roger's African expedition was not as it seemed, referring to that Negro woman Bune, Mweru's pseudonym Nchonka Bune, as being Roger's obsession. Erica's racist tendencies stem from her belief that Roger should not have been involved with an uneducated African woman. She has no idea how Roger met her, but does know that before Bune arrived, he was having strange dreams. It was Erica that recommended Dr. Robert Houston, and she blames Bune for everything. The investigators can ask her about the other members of the expedition, and she will give her opinions on them. Erica may even mention that Roger constantly read several old books that are stored in the safe in her library. The books are the Mythos manuscripts, the Panacotic manuscripts, Celestion's De Livre de Yvon, Amongst the Stones, and Life as a God, which, should the players manage to get their hands on them, can find out many things man was not meant to know. It then moves on to other inquiries. The first is Dr. Mordecai Lemming. Getting to meet him should be a fairly straightforward affair for those that behave correctly. He is delighted to see them and ushers them into one of his rooms. Asking him about Jackson Elias will cause them to giggle nervously before taking a swig from a hip flask. He informs them that he told the police that he suspected that the mark on the victims looked very much like that of an African death cult. He suspects that the police have the wrong man in prison for the murders. He advises them to speak to Mr. Silas Nkwani, the proprietor of Juju House in Harlem, if they want to know more about African folklore. The next person listed is Miriam Atwright, a person from Harvard University's Widener Library. She can confirm that Jackson sought a book called Africa's Dark Sects, which had mysteriously vanished from the library a few months earlier, mentioning that there was a strange smell there on the day they noticed it was missing. She can help identify the mark on Jackson's head. After this we have Professor Anthony Cowles. Originally from Sydney, Australia, he is currently a professor of anthropology at Miskatonic University, who has garnered a lot of attention due to his beautiful daughter, Eva. Finding him is fairly easy due to Eva and the attention she attracts from young men, though normal academic routes can be pursued in order to arrange a meeting. He's friendly and open, though knows little, having never met Jackson, though he has read several of his books. If flattered enough, he will give a summary of the lecture he gave recently. Through Cowles, the players can gain the names of contacts in Australia, Arthur McWare and Robert Mackenzie. This will be important later in the campaign. His lecture establishes that an Australian death cult that worshipped the Sambat once existed. Cowles has heard of the likes of Cthulhu and Arle and sees parallels between them and the Sambat. Both him and his daughter plan on returning to Sydney in a few months and may even participate in the Australia chapter with the investigators depending on when they arrive there. The last up here is Emerson Imports. Looking into them will reveal a warehouse piled high with goods and a small office that contains the owner, Arthur Emerson. He can recall Jackson visiting and offers his condolences. He can tell the investigators that Jackson intended on visiting Juju house to speak with Silas Nkwani, adding that Nkwani makes his skin crawl. The next section deals with the 5 Carlisle expedition principles. This is the information that can easily be obtained from the likes of newspaper articles, other people, etc. It's generally of a biographical nature, and the obvious missing character is Mweru, of which there is nothing written about. It also mentions Dr. Houston's files on Carlisle from when he was coming to him for psychiatric help. Smart investigators may be able to get hold of them should they do a bit of digging in the right places, and they are kept at the Medical Affairs Board offices on Park Avenue. The one that is the main source of interest is here. We then move to Harlem, of which it gives us information on how it was in the 1920s. That is a place plagued with police brutality, gang fights, and the famous Harlem Renaissance, which produced culturally significant art, literature and music, and it gives us a basic map of the area that shows all the main points of interest. This is all really basic, however, if you're interested in Harlem in that period, you may want to check out Darker Hue Studios' excellent Harlem Unbound sourcebook. It then moves on to the first piece of the Harlem story, An Innocent Man. This section begins with the New York Times and the investigators meeting Rebecca Schoenberg. They may visit her before the funeral should they find the right information out beforehand, but either way she is delighted to see them, especially if they admit that they were at the scene of the murder. If she knows they are on their way, she will retrieve the relevant clippings from her scrapbook with regard to Adams's murders. She advises that the police seem baffled at first, as other than the strange markings carved into the foreheads of the victims, they were completely unconnected. She suspects that due to the first few murders occurring in different police precincts, there was little coordination between the investigations. They can discover that everything was transferred to Captain Robson of the 14th Precinct and that Hilton Adams was arrested at the scene of the 8th murder. Schoenberg suspects that Robson is at best incompetent, at worst corrupt, and has framed Hilton Adams. Should the investigators share her concerns and willingness to investigate the situation, she will offer to introduce them to Millie Adams, Hilton's wife. Also, she offers to convince Hilton to see the investigators as visitors at Sing Sing if they want to speak to him directly. Adams's execution is looming, and all Rebecca wants is to expose Robson's corruption and cast doubt on Adams's conviction. The next section, should the investigators follow this course of action, will have Rebecca going ahead and setting up a meeting at the Lafayette Theatre in Harlem. Millie and Rebecca will be waiting for them when they arrive and usher them into the main auditorium to seats in the corner of the stalls. They'll be alone unless Nkwani or Mdari have been alerted. In that instance, a cult spy will be lurking nearby, masquerading as a cleaner, eavesdropping on the conversation. They can be discovered and chased down. If they are not spotted by the investigators, Millie will be dead within a week and transformed into a Chimba, a zombie-like guardian at Juju house. Millie is guarded when speaking to the investigators, especially if any of them are police officers, though she can have the story coaxed out of her if it is made clear that her husband's innocence may be provable, especially given the nature of Jackson Elias's death. She can tell them that her husband knew about the deaths and disappearances in Harlem over the last few years and offers them a deal. They try to exonerate him, and she will provide them with the information that may lead to the killers. She will tell them that Hilton had gathered a group of friends from the saloon that they hung out in called Teddy's, which is 2 blocks away, all of whom were former Harlem hellfighters who had served in the Great War. They'd started patrols to protect the community and investigate who was responsible. The police refused to investigate, claiming that it was gang violence and normal crime, even though an African cult was rumoured. They focused on the death cult link and managed to dig up some information from the New York Public Library, though Hilton's notes were confiscated by the police. She even mentions that he used a strip of red cloth as a bookmark, suspecting that it had some significance. The police were not happy with their actions and were warned about stirring up trouble, with pressure being applied to some of Hilton's friends by their employers, concerned that it would bring Harlem into disrepute. Hilton had mentioned that he thought there was a death cult operating in Harlem and that the police were covering it up. One night, just before he was arrested, she overheard him mention Juju House to his friend Needham Johnson, a reporter at the New York Age. Finally, she tells them that her husband was arrested in September 1924 after being found standing over a body. His army-issued bolo knife was recovered from the scene and formed the crux of the prosecution. She reveals that they have ongoing legal appeals, with money being raised by the patrons of Teddy's, though this wasn't enough and he now faces the electric chair. If pushed on Juju House, she will confirm that it is an African art emporium in Ransom Court run by Silas Nkwani. She has begun watching the premises and has noted that once a month around 20 to 30 people enter the shop in the early hours of the morning, and they seem to be a mix of lowlifes and blue-collar workers, though she didn't recognise any of them. She appreciates that it could just be an exclusive speakeasy in the basement, as she saw crates being delivered to Ransom Court one night. She will confess to believing that something more sinister is going on. She also has seen police detectives visiting Ransom Court during the daytime. Should the investigators make a good impression on her, she offers to convince Hilton to speak to them, though those who are rude or non-personable will fail to gain some valuable clues as to what is happening. The next section is the good friends of Hilton Adams. Millie Adams can supply the investigators with the name of her husband's team: Needham Johnson, Douglas Fells, Art Mills and Jackie Wallace, adding that the best place to find them is Teddy's Saloon, usually after work. Rebecca Schosenberg also knows the group, having met them once or twice. Millie won't introduce them to the investigators as she's still angry with them for, as she sees it, abandoning her husband. Teddy's is a well-attended saloon not far from the Lafayette Theatre, and if the investigators go there after the working day and ask for any of the men, they'll be directed towards the booth that the four of them sit in, huddled together drinking coffee. Each of them feels a deep guilt for abandoning their friend, and providing they don't become offended, they can tell the investigators what they know, which is frankly about as much as Millie Adams knows, plus a few other points. They will admit that after a while they figured out that a pattern was forming, usually at the same time each month, and that on one occasion Hilton stumbled across someone being attacked and drove them off. The red cloth that he used as a bookmark was torn off in the struggle. They will also tell the investigators that Hilton had tracked down a new lead connecting the murders with Juju House, but was arrested before he could act upon it. Following this, we have the investigators visiting Hilton Adams in Sing Sing. He gives a little of the history of the prison and even talks about the Death House, a place where death row inmates were kept within Sing Sing, essentially a prison within a prison. The electric chair here is affectionately known as Old Sparky. Should they get to meet Hilton, they'll be escorted by the subwarden George Brunton to his cell block and advised that they have 30 minutes to talk to him. They find Hilton in a cramped cell with no external window, waiting for them at the edge of his bed. Brunton will step back to afford everyone some privacy, and the investigators will find that he is polite, though sceptical, and sorry to hear that there has been another murder. He can tell them that the disappearances have been occurring for around 5 years, and that once he looked into it, he found that they were happening on a monthly basis during the dark of the moon, though they didn't seem to have any fixed schedule, and he is absolutely convinced that the last one was carried out just to frame him. He will assure them that it was not his knife that was used to murder the victims, as he had more sense than to take it on patrol with him, and that he carried his Army-issue service revolver for protection. He believes that the knife was taken when the police searched his tenement rooms and planted the evidence to use against him. He will reveal that following Dr. Mordecai Lemming's pronouncement to the press about an African death cult, they had found mention of something called the Cult of the Bloody Tongue, with links to Kenya, and that the only place in the area with African connections was Juju House. He will admit that the place gives him the creeps. He did obtain a name, Mukunga Mdari. The next section deals with Captain Robson and is called Bully Boys in Blue. Should the investigators have looked into Juju House before speaking to Millie Adams, Rebecca Schosenberg or any of Hilton's friends, they get a visit from some of Captain Robson's men. A small group of uniformed officers will be sent to send them a clear message. People stirring up trouble in this neighbourhood will be dealt with, and there is a genuine danger of arrest here, though this could be beneficial in that it will allow them to speak to Robson directly. If the first small word doesn't have the desired effect, Robson will send some detectives and the threats are more direct now, implying that the investigators' families could be in danger, or that they were behind Jackson Elias's death. If this has no effect, they'll be arrested and trumped up charges and dragged to 14th Precinct for an interview with Robson himself. They'll find him all smiles and charm, and those who are perceptive will think that he is a bit too well dressed for a man of his salary. He will threaten them with the fact that bad things can happen in Harlem and then let them go. If they have concrete evidence of what is happening in Juju House, he can be persuaded to come clean, insisting that he knew nothing about what was happening there and was happy to look the other way for a few more dollars, though it will only be under extreme circumstances that he will admit Hilton Adams was set up. The final section and conclusion to the America chapter is horror at Juju House. All clues should eventually lead the investigators to find out what is going on here. It is in Harlem at number 1 Ransom Court, which is a cluttered alley with a small 20-foot square courtyard. Other than the back doors of an abandoned pawn shop, it is the only building here. It presumes that the investigators are going to case the building before they make any kind of moves, and give some information on how to do this by things like asking the locals and hiding in the abandoned pawn shop. In the daytime, only a few people wander in and out during the official opening hours, usually African American. They may even spot deliveries from Emerson imports, though these are just interesting African art items. Only 3 people of note visit during the day. A smartly dressed white man in his mid-20s who appears to be carrying a gun, who can be seen tucking an envelope into his jacket as he leaves, and who can be recognised should the investigators have met him as one of Captain Robson's men. The second is a short, old African-American man who is balding and dressed in an old suit. This is Silas Nkwani. And the third is a muscular, shaven-headed African man, Mukunga Mdari. It gives information on where Mdari will go should the investigators tail him, and then moves on to what happens after hours. If one night they are lucky enough to be keeping an eye on Juju House, they will witness cultists arriving for the meeting or ritual. They may spot people that they've seen before doing normal jobs at the likes of Emerson Imports, though judging by the size of the shop they will surmise that there must be a larger room or basement. We then move on to entering Juju House. Examining the shop front will reveal that it consists of a display window and a glass door, both of which are curtained, masking the interior but showing genuine pieces of African art. The shop interior is just 15 by 20 foot, with another room linked to the main one behind a thick blanket where Silas and Kwani lives. The whole place is dirty, dusty and piled with African tribal art and junk. It has an oppressive and uneasy feel to it. Standing behind a counter of a glass cabinet during normal opening hours wearing a red Masai shuka is Nkwani, who will be all toothless smiles and inquiring about what the customers are looking for. Nkwani may or may not be aware who the investigators are, though immediately asking him about African death cults will raise his suspicions, and he will memorise their faces. He'll play innocent and afterwards get Mdari to put a tail on them to see where else they go. If the investigators want to break into Juju House, they have two windows of opportunity, lunchtimes and early evening, when Nkwani leaves the building for food. If they manage to get into the shop, they can find a ledger containing the reference WR14, a reference to Walter Robson of Precinct 14. Searching his room could unearth his bloody tongue mask with mummified human tongue and his panga wrapped in leopard skin. A trapdoor is hidden beneath a rug behind the shop counter, revealing a set of stairs that lead 20 feet down, ending in a stone door. Behind the door is a room that runs the length of the shop that is a sacrificial chamber that is dressed completely in stone. There are symbols here that a Cthulhu mythos role will reveal are related to the Great Old Ones. A curtain covers a small alcove and large African drums line the walls. At one end of the room is a pit covered by a thick stone block with a winch above it. This contains the Chakota, more on that in a bit. The alcove contains 4 Chimba, the Kikuyu equivalent of zombies. These watch over the chamber and are incredibly strong. All are mutilated victims of the cult, with intestines hanging out and their foreheads bearing the bloody tongue symbol. There's every possibility that Millie Adams is one of them. Contained within the alcove are Mdari's treasures. There is a priest robe with lion claws on it hanging on a peg, a bloody tongue mask, the Africa's Dark Sect book that was stolen from Harvard University, a carved wooden African tribal mask known as the Mask of Nyarlathotep, a burnished copper bowl etched with runes and symbols, a carved baobab scepter inset with runes, a headband of grey metal that is etched with cuneiform runes and curiously worn, a modern marine chronometer that is synchronised to GMT, and a locked cash box that contains the personal effects of all of the cult's victims. This is the evidence needed to free Hilton Adams. Some of the artefacts are magical in nature and their use can be divined through the use of skills and knowledge. In the pit is the foul Chakota, known as the spirit of many faces and worshipped by the cult. It is a thick cylindrical worm-like mass that is covered in sickly purple-veined muscle that is about 8 feet long and 6 feet in diameter, and its surface is covered in dozens of faces that weep, shout and cry all at once. All faces are of its victims. As faces are added, its bulk grows and a new face appears around 2 hours after it has ingested the sacrifices that are made to it, which is at least 2 per month. The stone block on top of the pit silences it, but once lifted, a cacophony of shrieks fill the room. If it is not fed within 10 minutes, the faces become more agitated and redouble their wails, attracting attention from the shop above. We then move on to what is actually done in the basement of Juju House. Once a month, sacrifices are brought below and around 30 cultists attend. If any investigators are captured, they will be delivered by packing crate. Everything starts around 1 to 1:30 am. During this period, the court above goes unwatched. If the investigators are lucky, they can enter the shop without being detected, and they can possibly witness the rites taking place. Firstly, the cultists take off their clothes and put on their bloody tongue headpieces. There, they chant and dance for hours until Mdari is satisfied a frenzy has been reached. He will then carve the heads of the sacrifices and then pronounce an invocation that clearly says Nyarlathotep. Then the stone cap is lifted from the pit and the screaming victims are tossed inside, with the occasional frenzied cultist jumping in as a willing sacrifice. The victims are devoured and absorbed by the Chakota. Mdari wears a feathered robe and lion's claws during the ritual and can attack with the claws if required. Mdari can even summon a hunting cotter to assist in any trouble they may experience. With all the commotion going on below, the stone door being opened to observe will not be noticed. The cultists have no weapons, though a stock of spears, knives and clubs are in the shop above, though a group of naked howling cultists will undoubtedly attract attention from local residents and the police. It then moves on to dealing with the cult. There are no written records kept by Nkwani or Mdari on who is in the cult, and the only real items that could expose them are hidden within the alcove in the basement, though neutralising the chimber is a sturdy obstacle in the way. Photographic evidence can be used, though the flash will definitely alert the cultists, though one of the detectives collecting bribes could be given to Lieutenant Poole. Depending on the evidence they obtain, the police could raid Juju House on a ritual night if the timing is correct, though if Mdari gets wind of this, he would clear out all evidence and burn the shop to the ground. This would leave Hilton Adams certain to go to Old Sparky. If the investigators insist on taking on the whole cult by themselves, or even resort to drastic measures such as setting fire to the shop themselves, Hilton Adams is almost sure to be executed. Essentially, luck and good planning are required here to be successful. This is the conclusion to the chapter, and the investigators have to now make a choice on where to go next, as England, Egypt, Kenya, Australia and China are all available to them via the clues they have found. Following this, it suggests giving the investigators a development phase during the time they spend on the boat going wherever they go next, and a raft of sanity gains and losses that are dependent on what the players have accomplished in this chapter. This is followed by sets of stats for the various police, including Lieutenant Poole and Captain Robson, and it has all of the pertinent NPCs and adversaries, and includes the stats for the Foul, Chakotay and the Chimba. After this, it has the stats for various people that the investigators could hire to do particular jobs for them, such as safe cracking, pickpocketing, and muscle for protection. Okay, that concludes the American chapter. The next one will be a 2-part video on Chapter 2, England.